Sir, I said economy is in the back." The words cracked like a whip across the quiet first-class cabin. A few heads turned. A young woman clutched her toddler tighter. A man behind his laptop paused mid-typing. Malcolm Rowe blinked slowly, unsure if he'd heard her right. His boarding pass was still in his hand, clear as day, 1A. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice measured. The flight attendant, her name tag read Carolyn, stepped closer, arms crossed, lips pursed. "You can't just assume you can sit up here. These seats are for first class." "I know," Malcolm replied evenly, extending his boarding pass. Carolyn glanced at it, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a beat. This must be a mistake. Malcolm remained still, his tailored suit neatly pressed, the glint of his lapel pin catching the overhead light. Passengers were now fully tuned in. Some watching discreetly, others staring openly. The air was heavy with something unsaid, something many had seen before, but rarely this loud, this public. No one spoke, but phones slid silently into recording mode. Malcolm felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments settle on his shoulders. Again. This wasn't new, not the look, not the tone, not the assumption. He could hear his father's voice from years ago. "You'll have to wear your resume like armor." And so he did. Harvard Law, decorated veteran, sitting governor of a swing state. Yet here he was, seen as just another black man in the wrong place. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. That would give them what they wanted. Instead, he breathed in, slow and deep, and asked himself the same question he always asked. What would power do right now? Carolyn sighed sharply and took a step back, shaking her head. "You people always try this. Always pushing, always testing limits." The words weren't loud, but they landed like gunshots. Gasps rippled through the cabin, tiny, shocked exhales. A businessman in row 2 shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A teenager near the bulkhead glanced at his phone, started recording. Another passenger whispered, "Did she just say you people?" Carolyn didn't notice or didn't care. She waved toward the rear of the plane. "You need to move before boarding is delayed for everyone." The crowd watched, awkward and frozen. No one intervened, because that's what usually happened. People watched. They whispered. But they didn't speak. Malcolm remained seated. His silence is now louder than her words. He turned, locking eyes with a woman across the aisle, her face pale, conflicted. She looked away. Phones continued filming, low and discreet, but present. No one said a word. Not a single passenger had risen to defend him. And yet, eyes darted. Whispers grew. A few exchanged guilty glances, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. This was real-time injustice, playing out in first class. And it was being captured, not a punch thrown, not a scream shouted. But it was violence all the same. Malcolm finally broke his silence. "Can I speak with your supervisor?" Carolyn folded her arms tighter. "If you don't comply, security can escort you off this flight. Is that what you want?" The threat was casual, practiced, weaponized politeness backed by institutional power. Malcolm stared at her, unmoving. "I asked for a supervisor." Carolyn's smile was tight. "I'll notify the captain." The teenager filming dropped his phone into his lap, whispering to his mother, "Is this really happening?" She didn't answer. Malcolm stood slowly, straightening his jacket. The cabin watched, holding its collective breath. "You're right," he said softly. "I am in the wrong place." Carolyn's face lit up with smug relief. Malcolm turned, calm, deliberate, and leaned in, just enough for her to hear. "I'm supposed to be at the gate. They're waiting for me to board with the crew." Carolyn's smile faltered. He held up his credentials. A glint of gold, a photo, the seal. "Governor Malcolm Rowe," he said, "and this incident, it's not going unnoticed." Her face drained of color as gasps followed, and the camera kept rolling. Malcolm Rowe had perfected the art of silence. He'd been taught early in life to never raise his voice, to never show his anger, no matter how deeply it burned. Even in the face of injustice, he stayed calm. To many, he was an enigma, a successful black man with a presence that commanded respect. But behind the suit, behind the smooth talk and sharp intellect, was a man who'd spent years fighting battles that others couldn't see. Battles fought with dignity, restraint, and the strength to keep pushing forward, no matter what was thrown his way. Malcolm was born in the heart of Birmingham, Alabama, where the sounds of struggle were embedded in the very air. Raised by his single mother, a woman who worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, he learned early on that survival was about resilience. His mother, a quiet force, made sure he knew what the world expected of him. From the moment he was old enough to understand, Malcolm experienced the ugliness of racial prejudice. He was the child who was followed around in stores, the teenager who was pulled over without reason, the young man whose intelligence was doubted simply because of his skin. But his mother's words echoed in his mind. "You carry yourself better than they ever will, Malcolm. Don't let them take your peace." Those words were his shield, even in the darkest moments. Birmingham was a city that refused to forget its past, but Malcolm wanted to rise above it, because he had to. Despite the obstacles, Malcolm's brilliance couldn't be ignored. He aced every test, earned top grades, and eventually found himself in Harvard Law, a world far removed from the dusty streets of his childhood. Yet, even there, he had to fight for every inch of respect. Professors raised eyebrows when he answered questions with ease. His peers questioned his place, assuming he was just another affirmative action success story. But Malcolm kept his head down, focusing on the books, knowing that every inch he gained was a statement to the world that his intellect was undeniable. Malcolm's rise from the streets of Birmingham to the State House of Alabama was nothing short of revolutionary. He became a community organizer, a voice for those silenced by systemic inequality. Through relentless work, he rose through the political ranks, eventually becoming the first black governor of the state. It was an achievement that sent shockwaves through a region built on centuries of segregation and oppression. For Malcolm, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a symbol of progress, a message to the world that no matter how deep the roots of racism ran, they could be uprooted. Yet, even as governor, Malcolm could not escape the ever-present shadow of racism. At high-end stores, he was often treated like a thief, his credit card scrutinized, his ID questioned. Neighbors who once greeted him with smiles now started from their windows when he walked his dog. And then there were the police, called on him for nothing more than being in his own neighborhood. Malcolm had climbed to the highest office in the state, but none of it shielded him from the racial profiling that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Success, it seemed, was never enough. As Malcolm prepared for a racial justice conference, dressed in his sharpest suit, his mind remained focused on the work ahead. But the moment he boarded the plane, the reminder of his reality came crashing back. The first-class seat that should have been his became another battleground in a long war. Malcolm handed his first-class ticket to the gate agent, a woman who didn't seem to notice the smile he flashed her. She barely glanced at it before she took a second, longer look, then a third. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with skepticism. He nodded, keeping his voice calm. "Yes, ma'am, that's my ticket." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she typed something into the system and looked at him again. This time, she checked his ID more thoroughly, scanning it like she was unsure if the face on the card matched the man in front of her. Malcolm could feel the weight of the moment settling between them, his patience waning as he forced a smile. "I just wanted to make sure," she said, handing him the ticket as if it was some kind of concession. But to Malcolm, the message was clear. His presence wasn't quite right, even here, even in this place of supposed equality. As Malcolm moved towards the boarding line, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts around him. The way a woman gripped her purse just a little tighter when he stepped into line. The elderly man who, without looking, shifted a step away from him. He could feel the eyes on his back, assessing, doubting, sizing him up as if he didn't belong. It was the same everywhere he went. This quiet tension, these whispers in the air that had nothing to do with words. He was used to it by now, but that didn't make it any easier. A couple in front of him shifted uncomfortably, as if they were trying to position themselves just far enough away from him without causing a scene. A child, barely old enough to understand, stared at him with wide eyes. Malcolm's heart tightened. The message was clear. He didn't belong in this space. No matter the title he held, no matter how far he'd come, the child's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Mommy, why is the janitor in this line?" Malcolm froze. The words landed like a punch to the gut, coming from such an innocent place. The mother, caught off guard, quickly shushed the child, offering a tight, apologetic smile. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Malcolm could see it in the mother's face. She didn't correct the child. She didn't say anything. She just pulled the child closer, offering a weak smile to him. He wasn't just the black man in line anymore. He was a janitor in their eyes. The pain wasn't in the question, but in the silence that followed. When Malcolm finally reached the gate, he saw Carolyn Whitmore, the flight attendant, standing by the entrance. She greeted each passenger with a warm smile, a professional but kind expression on her face. But when she saw him, that smile faltered. For just a fraction of a second, the warmth was replaced with something colder, more calculating. He'd seen it before, this shift in people's demeanor when they realized who he was and where he'd come from. But it still stung. The smile had disappeared, replaced by something that was harder to read, something that made him feel, once again, like an outsider. Carolyn stepped forward as he approached the first-class cabin, blocking his path with a hand that was just a little too firm, a little too deliberate. "This section's for first-class passengers only," she said, her voice polite but unmistakably sharp. Malcolm, taken aback, tried to explain himself. "I'm in first class, my ticket—" "I know what your ticket says," she interrupted, her eyes flicking back to the boarding list. "But I'm not sure you belong here." Her words hit him like a slap. He stared at her, trying to process what he'd just heard. His mind raced, but he knew better than to let anger take control. He didn't want to escalate it, but the injustice was too much to ignore. "I assure you, I'm in the right seat," he said, maintaining his calm. But Carolyn wasn't backing down. She glanced down at her tablet, then back at him, as if he was the one who was mistaken. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice cool. "First-class passengers need to board first. I'm not sure I've seen you here before." Malcolm's heart began to race. This wasn't just about his seat. It was about everything he had fought for, everything he had achieved, and the clear, undeniable message that none of it mattered in this moment. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in her world, not in their world. The crowd behind him began to notice. Whispers started to ripple through the line, and though they weren't loud, they were enough to make Malcolm's skin crawl. Carolyn's voice became the focal point, her treatment of him becoming the spectacle. He could feel the heat of their eyes on him, the silent judgment of bystanders who stood by, not a single person speaking out. It wasn't the words that cut the deepest, it was the silence, the way they stood there watching, not a single person stepping in to help. He wasn't just being questioned, he was being judged, quietly and publicly, for who he was and where he stood. The air between Malcolm and Carolyn crackled with tension, a stillness that had settled over the entire boarding area. He was about to step past her and into the first-class section when she raised her voice, sharp and accusatory. "Don't make me call security." Carolyn's words cut through the air. "I know what you're doing, trying to sneak into first class like you belong here." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His ticket was right there in his hand, his ID clear, but it didn't seem to matter. The subtle disdain in Carolyn's voice was now open hostility. "I'm in the right seat," Malcolm said, his voice steady, but his mind racing. "I've got the ticket to prove it." But Carolyn wasn't listening. "You think I don't know when someone's trying to pull a stunt like this? First class is for people like me. Not people like you." The words hung in the air, each one a barb designed to wound, to remind him of his place. Malcolm felt a heat rise in his chest, a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had worked his entire life for moments like this, to be here, to take this flight as an equal among the rich and the privileged. But now it was as if none of it mattered, as if his accomplishments, his very existence, were being questioned simply because of the color of his skin. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with discomfort. Passengers who had been murmuring among themselves only moments before now fell silent, watching the scene unfold in front of them. Some faces showed confusion, others annoyance, but no one said a word. Then a phone screen lit up. Someone in the back was recording, their phone pointed at Malcolm and Carolyn. The soft tap of fingers on glass was the only sound, a reminder that the world was watching, but no one was intervening. Another voice piped up from further down the aisle, a man who had watched the exchange with growing concern. "Hey, that's not necessary. He's got a first-class ticket. You can't do that." Carolyn's eyes flicked toward the man, but instead of backing down, she let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, please," she said, turning her full attention to him. "I know what I'm doing." The man faltered, clearly thrown off by her confidence. "He's just—" "Don't tell me what to do," Carolyn snapped. "Maybe he should learn his place." Her words echoed in the cabin, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Malcolm's pulse quickened. He wanted to speak out, but something in Carolyn's eyes told him that speaking his truth here would only make it worse. Instead, he stood there, painfully aware of the eyes watching him from every direction. A voice rose from the crowd, this time with a bit more authority. "That's Governor Malcolm Rowe," a man called out, pushing his way down the aisle. He was tall, his suit well-tailored, and there was an air of authority about him. The name hung in the air, but instead of giving him a break, Carolyn only sneered. "So what?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "What does that mean to me? It doesn't change the fact that he's trying to sneak into first class where he doesn't belong." The man's brow furrowed, frustration evident in his voice. "You don't get it, do you? He's not just some random passenger. He's a governor, a man who has worked his entire life to be where he is. Maybe you should show some respect." Carolyn's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Respect? For someone who's trying to get in where he doesn't belong? Sorry, but I don't think so." The man stood there, stunned, his hands raised slightly as though trying to grasp the gravity of what was happening. But Carolyn wasn't finished. She turned back to Malcolm, her eyes cold. "Maybe, if you hadn't been so eager to prove yourself, I wouldn't have had to remind you that you're not one of us." The gate manager peered from behind the curtain, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. He was a stocky man in a blue suit, and when he saw the situation, he stepped forward with a look of mild disinterest, as if this was just another disruption in his day. Malcolm opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, the manager waved a hand, cutting him off. "What's going on here?" Carolyn's voice was quick to answer. "This man is trying to sneak into first class. He's got no business being here. I've asked him to leave, but he's refusing." The manager didn't even glance at Malcolm's ticket or ID. Instead, he looked straight at Carolyn, nodding in agreement. "I see. Well, we can't have this kind of disruption. I'll have to ask you to step back to your seat, sir." Malcolm's stomach sank. It wasn't just Carolyn now, it was the system. The whole infrastructure was against him. It wasn't about facts or decency. It was about power, about reinforcing a hierarchy that didn't recognize him as an equal. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he realized there was no point in fighting it. He was already being dismissed, invisible to the system that was supposed to protect him. As the situation continued to unfold, Malcolm felt the weight of the eyes on him, 1,000 silent gazes pressing in from every direction. But there was one that cut deeper than all the rest. A child, no older than 6, was staring up at him from a seat near the front. Her eyes were wide with confusion, innocence wrapped in an unfiltered gaze. "Why is he in trouble, Mommy?" the child asked, her voice pure and untainted by the world. Malcolm's heart clenched. In that moment he saw himself through her eyes, confused, misunderstood, caught in a system that had already labeled him. The weight of her gaze crushed him, not because of her question, but because of what she would learn from this moment. She was learning that people like him didn't belong in places like this, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The guilt, the shame, the rage, everything inside him seemed to collapse at once, like a heavy burden pressing down on his chest. He forced himself to take a breath, to steady himself, but the cracks were starting to show. In that moment of crushing silence, Malcolm took a deep breath and stepped aside. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his official credentials. His governor's badge, the symbol of all his hard work, his sacrifice, the years of overcoming barriers that had been placed in his way. He held it up, letting the light catch the metal just enough for everyone to see. The moment was thick with disbelief. Carolyn blinked twice, her eyes narrowing as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. She opened her mouth to say something, but Malcolm spoke first, his voice cutting through the tension with the quiet authority he had fought so hard to attain. "You wanted to remind me of my place?" he asked, his words steady, calm, despite the storm inside him. "Well, this is my place. I belong here. I've earned every inch of it, and it's not your place to decide who gets to be in this space." The silence in the cabin seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, Carolyn's smug expression faltered. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Malcolm tucked the badge back into his jacket, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "And just so you know," he added, "this isn't the first time I've had to fight to be seen. It won't be the last." Malcolm stood there, his hand clenched around his credentials, the weight of the badge in his palm heavy with meaning. He took a slow breath, the chaos of the moment still buzzing in his ears. He didn't need to say anything at first. He let the silence hang like a storm cloud over the cabin. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, each second stretching like an eternity. Then he calmly raised his badge, the glint of official authority catching the light as he spoke. "This," he said, his voice low but firm, "is who I am." The cabin fell into dead silence. For a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. The air was thick with tension, with the collective realization slowly settling in that they had all been wrong. Carolyn's sneer faltered, her lips parting slightly in shock. The other passengers who had stayed quiet now looked at each other, the disbelief evident on their faces. The reality of what had just happened, what they had witnessed, was slowly sinking in. Malcolm's posture remained unmoved, but the power dynamics in the room had shifted. He was no longer the subject of the unjust accusations. Now, the weight of the truth hung heavily over Carolyn and the others. The gate manager, who had been standing off to the side, now took a hesitant step forward. His eyes darted from Carolyn to Malcolm, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The sudden pressure in the air seemed to paralyze him, and he stammered, I'll need to verify." But he stopped mid-sentence. Carolyn, who had been holding her ground just moments before, suddenly looked like a deflated balloon. Her earlier arrogance dissolved, leaving behind only the bitter sting of shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The passengers who had been quiet witnesses now shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, while others stared at Carolyn with an expression of disbelief. One passenger, a woman in her 50s, shook her head slowly, murmuring, "You were wrong." Carolyn's face turned red as she tried to compose herself, but the weight of her actions and the looks of judgment from the cabin filled her with panic. From the back of the cabin, a voice broke through the silence. It was a man, standing a few rows behind Malcolm, holding up his phone. "This is going viral tonight," he said, the words loud enough for everyone to hear. The phone's camera was already recording, capturing the entire situation. The man's tone was a mix of awe and disbelief as he stared at the unfolding scene, clearly aware of the bigger picture now. The murmurs spread quickly through the cabin. Some passengers leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Others pulled out their own phones, the sound of notifications and clicking cameras echoing through the cabin. Malcolm knew in that moment that this was no longer just about him. It was about something much larger, a moment that was going to ripple far beyond the confines of this plane. Suddenly, the cockpit door swung open. A man in uniform stepped out, his face lighting up when he saw Malcolm. The recognition was instantaneous. "Governor Rowe!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with respect and surprise. "What's going on here?" Malcolm's face softened slightly. "Nothing I can't handle." But the pilot wasn't done. He took a step toward Malcolm, his voice loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "I'll take it from here, sir," he said, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. "Governor Rowe deserves respect. Let's not forget that." The words cut through the tension like a blade, and for a moment the cabin seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The power that had been stripped from Malcolm moments ago was now being restored. Not by his own words, but by the quiet affirmation of someone who had the authority to do so. The pilot gestured toward the front of the plane. "I'll personally escort you to your seat, Governor. Please follow me." Malcolm nodded, grateful but keeping his composure. As he walked past Carolyn, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of the cabin on him. But this time, they weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with respect. Carolyn's voice wavered, her confidence crumbling. I didn't know," she muttered, her words barely audible. Her gaze shifted from the pilot to Malcolm, but the shame was too much for her to hide. Malcolm stopped walking and turned toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke with a quiet authority that cut through her apology like a razor. "You didn't know? Or did you just assume that because of the color of my skin, I didn't belong?" The words hung in the air, and Carolyn flinched, as if the truth had slapped her across the face. The passengers around them were now all watching, the tension that had once been on Malcolm now directed at her. "You made an assumption based on nothing but bias," Malcolm continued, his voice steady. "You let that assumption control you, and that's on you, not me." Carolyn opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The weight of her ignorance was too overwhelming, and in that moment she realized there was no defending herself. Malcolm took a final step forward, his voice carrying across the cabin with clear, unwavering strength. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, addressing the passengers. "What just happened here wasn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the assumptions we make based on skin color, the bias that seeps into our daily lives, and the courage it takes to challenge it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Don't let this moment pass. Don't let your silence be your consent to injustice." With that, he turned and followed the pilot to the front of the plane, the door to the cockpit swinging closed behind him. The cabin remained still, the weight of his words hanging in the air long after the conversation had ended. By the time Malcolm's flight touched down, the world had already turned upside down. The video had exploded across the internet, reaching millions within hours. Screens lit up everywhere, from smartphones to TV broadcasts. People were sharing, commenting, and debating the events on that plane, and Malcolm's calm in the face of such adversity became a symbol of strength. The numbers climbed steadily. 2.5 million views, then 5 million, then 10. Each click was a ripple in a growing wave of national outrage. The comment sections were flooded with impassioned voices. Some condemned Carolyn's behavior, while others expressed admiration for Malcolm's dignity. The hashtag number Respect Malcolm trended, while Stand Up to Racism gained traction. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a turning point in a larger conversation about racial bias and respect. Malcolm's phone buzzed with notifications, but he didn't check them. He already knew what had happened. The world was watching now. Back at the airline's headquarters, chaos erupted. The PR team scrambled to address the fallout. By the time Malcolm's plane had landed, the airline had already issued a public apology, suspending Carolyn and pledging to undergo sensitivity training for all employees. They promised that this incident would serve as a lesson, but it was clear their damage control was just an attempt to save face. "We are deeply sorry for the incident that occurred," the official statement read. "We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind and are committed to ensuring this does not happen again." But even as they issued their apology, the truth was undeniable. The public wasn't satisfied with mere words. They wanted action, and the airline's hasty response wasn't enough to erase the damage done. Malcolm watched the media coverage unfold, his heart heavy yet resolute. As he prepared for his next speaking engagement, he knew he couldn't let this moment pass without transforming it into something bigger, something that would resonate beyond the incident itself. In front of a packed auditorium, Malcolm took the stage. The crowd's applause echoed in his ears, but he was focused. He stood tall, speaking into the microphone with quiet authority. "This incident on that plane wasn't just about one person or one moment," Malcolm said, his voice calm yet powerful. "It's about the everyday biases that we allow to fester and grow. It's about the assumptions we make without thinking, the stereotypes that shape how we see each other. But we don't have to accept that. We can choose to rise above it." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is not just my fight. This is all of our fight. Let's turn pain into power and make sure this never happens again." The crowd fell silent, then erupted into applause, the room filled with a collective sense of purpose. The message wasn't just for the moment. It was a call to action, one that would linger long after his speech ended. Across the country, people reacted. Social media was flooded with messages of support. Fans of all ages, from teenagers to emotional elders, reached out to Malcolm, praising his strength and composure. "You didn't let them break you," one young man wrote. "You showed us how to stay dignified in the face of hate." Elders shared their own stories of injustice, some tearfully recounting the battles they'd fought for equality. "I wish I had your courage," one woman said in a message, "but I will be fighting harder now because of you." Malcolm's phone was flooded with texts, emails, and social media mentions, but it was the heartfelt messages from everyday people that touched him the most. He wasn't just a figure on the internet anymore. He was a symbol of hope for those who had long felt marginalized and unheard. What started as a humiliating moment for Malcolm on a flight had transformed into something far greater. The viral video, once a symbol of his mistreatment, had become a catalyst for change. People across the nation were reflecting on their own biases, having difficult but necessary conversations about race, respect, and fairness. The moment had sparked a movement. What was once a deeply personal injustice had become a call to action for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. Malcolm had turned his humiliation into hope, not just for himself, but for an entire nation ready to face its flaws head-on. And this was just the beginning. Imagine this. You're on a plane, just minding your own business. But then, someone's targeted unfairly, disrespected because of their skin color. A woman in power calls out the injustice, and you're stuck, unsure how to act. What would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stepped in, picture it, feel it? Injustice can strike anywhere, but how we respond matters. It doesn't have to be blatant for it to hurt. The quiet slights, the microaggressions that slide by, unnoticed by most, but are deeply felt by the person on the receiving end. Have you experienced that? The times someone made a comment that stung just a little too much, but you didn't know how to call it out. It's there, lurking in the everyday. This isn't just about one person's story. It's about standing for what's right, no matter the situation. If you believe in dignity and fairness, show it. Like this video, share the message, and let's stand together. Don't stop here. Subscribe for more truth-driven stories and join the movement to make change. Together, we can keep this conversation alive and impact real change. Spread the word, share this video, and make the message heard. People need to see this. They need to hear the truth. Let's make this moment louder, together.